accident.
23 games, 7 layers. This is the most disturbing Japanese games iceberg you've never seen before. Now, before we dive into this digital nightmare, I need to set some ground rules. Everything on this iceberg represents actual games that were developed and released, not just rumors or urban legends. Some of these titles are so disturbing that even discussing them feels uncomfortable, but understanding the darkest corners of gaming history helps us appreciate how far the medium has come. As we descend through each layer, the content becomes increasingly disturbing, so consider this your only warning. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1 represents games that are strange and unsettling, but still manage to find mainstream attention. These titles pushed boundaries in ways that made people uncomfortable, yet somehow found their way onto store shelves. Is exactly what it sounds like, and yes, it's a real fighting game released by Illusion in 2002. The core mechanics follow traditional fighting game conventions, but with a twisted premise that makes Street Fighter look like a children's cartoon. Players engage in combat where successful attacks gradually destroy the opponent's clothing until they're completely exposed. The disturbing element isn't just the obvious exploitation, but how the developers try to market it as a legitimate fighting game with tournament-worthy mechanics. What makes particularly unsettling is its clinical approach to objectification. The game features detailed damage systems, combo mechanics, and even special finishing moves, all around content that serves no purpose beyond titillation. Japanese gaming magazines at the time reviewed it seriously, discussing frame data and move properties while completely ignoring the elephant in the room. The disconnect between treating it as legitimate entertainment while featuring such exploitative content creates an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that defines much of this iceberg. The sequel doubled down on everything that made the original controversial while adding even more disturbing elements. Released in 2005, it expanded the roster and introduced new mechanics that somehow managed to be even more exploitative than its predecessor. What's most disturbing isn't just the content itself, but how casually it was accepted within certain gaming circles as just another fighting game. Beach, also developed by Illusion, represents the logical extreme of dating simulation taken to its most uncomfortable conclusion. Released as a series starting in 2003, these games combine beach vacation settings with content that crosses every line of decency. Players assume the role of a vacationer who can interact with various female characters through increasingly inappropriate scenarios. The Sexy Beach series demonstrates how Japanese developers could create elaborate game systems around the most exploitative premises imaginable. These aren't simple visual novels, but complex simulation games with relationship mechanics, multiple endings, and detailed character progression systems. The technical competence behind the development makes the content even more disturbing because it shows how much effort went into creating something so fundamentally wrong. What makes Sexy Beach particularly notorious is its international distribution, despite containing content that would be illegal in many countries. The series spawned multiple sequels and spin-offs, creating an entire franchise built around content that most civilized societies would reject outright. The casual acceptance of these titles within certain gaming communities reveals uncomfortable truths about how exploitation can be normalized through technical polish and genre conventions. Moving deeper into level 1, we encounter Girl, another Illusion title that pushes the boundaries of what constitutes a video game versus what constitutes something else entirely. Released in 2003, Girl presents itself as a life simulation where players create and interact with virtual characters in a detailed 3D environment. The game features surprisingly sophisticated character creation tools, allowing players to customize every aspect of their virtual companions down to the smallest details. These technical features demonstrate genuine innovation in character modeling and animation systems that would later influence mainstream games. However, all this technical prowess serves content that transforms what should be creative expression into something deeply uncomfortable. Girl spawned multiple sequels, each more technically advanced than the last. The series demonstrates how cutting-edge technology can be used to serve the lowest impulses rather than elevating human experience. The contrast between the sophisticated game engines and the disturbing content they enable creates a cognitive dissonance that runs throughout Japanese gaming's darker corners. School Days represents a different kind of disturbing content, one that masks psychological horror behind the veneer of a typical dating simulation. Developed by Zervaflow and released in 2005, School Days initially appears to be a standard visual novel about high school romance. Players follow protagonist Makoto Itu as he navigates relationships with various female classmates in what seems like a typical coming-of-age story. However, School Days quickly reveals itself as something far more sinister. The game's branching narrative paths lead to increasingly dark scenarios involving obsession, betrayal, and psychological manipulation. What starts as innocent teenage spirals into a nightmarish exploration of jealousy and revenge that culminates in some of the most disturbing endings ever featured in a visual novel. The most notorious aspect of School Days isn't just its violent content, but how it presents this violence as the natural consequence of the protagonist's actions. The game forces players to confront the results of their choices through unflinching depictions of emotional and physical trauma. Unlike typical horror games that rely on supernatural threats, School Days finds its horror in human psychology pushed to its breaking point. School Days gained international notoriety when its anime adaptation was pulled from television broadcasts following a real-world incident that mirrored the game's violent themes. This connection between fictional content and real-world tragedy highlights the uncomfortable questions these games raise about the relationship between entertainment and social responsibility. The visual novel's impact extends beyond its immediate shock value. School Days influenced an entire subgenre of psychological horror games that use familiar settings and characters to explore humanity's darkest impulses. Its legacy can be seen in countless games that promise innocent but deliver psychological trauma instead. As we prepare to descend to level 2, it's worth noting that everything we've discussed so far represents content that was commercially released and widely available. These games found their way into mainstream gaming channels despite their disturbing content, suggesting a cultural acceptance that becomes even more troubling as we dig deeper. The titles on level 1 share common characteristics that define much of this iceberg. They combine technical competence with morally questionable content, creating products that can't be dismissed as amateur shock value but represent genuine development efforts directed toward disturbing ends. This combination of skill and moral bankruptcy creates a uniquely unsettling category of entertainment that challenges our assumptions about creative expression and artistic freedom. Moreover, the commercial success of these titles reveals uncomfortable truths about market demand for such content. These weren't underground curiosities, but products that generated enough revenue to spawn sequels and inspire images. The fact that skilled developers, publishers, and retailers all participated in bringing these games to market suggests a systemic problem rather than incidents of poor judgment. Level 2 beckons us deeper into the abyss, where the games become more obscure but significantly more disturbing. Here we'll encounter titles that push beyond what even the permissive Japanese market could easily accept, games that found themselves restricted, banned, or relegated to the darkest corners of digital distribution. The descent continues, and each layer reveals how far human creativity can be corrupted when freed from moral constraints. What we've seen so far represents merely the surface of a much deeper problem, one that challenges our understanding of games as harmless entertainment and forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the medium's potential for both creation and destruction. Level 2, where mainstream acceptance gives way to underground distribution and whispered recommendations. These games represent a turning point where developers began pushing boundaries not just for commercial success, but seemingly for the sake of transgression itself. The Discipline series, developed by ActiveSoft, emerged in 2004 as what initially appeared to be a standard visual novel set in an elite private academy. Players assume the role of a new teacher at St. Alcadia Academy, a prestigious institution where wealthy families send their daughters for education. The setup feels familiar, almost comforting in its adherence to established genre conventions. However, Discipline quickly reveals its true nature through a narrative that transforms educational authority into something far more sinister. The game's story, progression, involves the systematic corruption of both students and faculty through increasingly manipulative scenarios. What makes Discipline particularly disturbing isn't just its explicit content, but how it weaponizes the power dynamics of educational settings. The developers at ActiveSoft demonstrated remarkable attention to detail in creating their twisted academic environment. Every aspect of St. Alcadia Academy feels meticulously crafted, from the Gothic architecture to the detailed class schedules that govern daily life. This level of world building serves to make the violations feel more impactful because they occur within such a carefully constructed facade of respectability. Discipline spawned multiple episodes, each more extreme than the last. The series' progression mirrors a descent into moral bankruptcy, with each installment removing another layer of restraint until nothing remains but pure exploitation dressed in the trappings of sophisticated storytelling. The technical quality never wavers, making the content's evolution even more disturbing because it demonstrates deliberate creative choices rather than accidental boundary crossing. Bible Black represents perhaps the most notorious entry in Level 2, a visual novel that combines occult themes with explicit content in ways that create genuine psychological discomfort. Developed by ActiveSoft and released in 2001, Bible Black follows high school student Taki Minas as he discovers a mysterious grimoire hidden in his school's basement. What begins as supernatural curiosity quickly transforms into something far more disturbing as the game explores themes of demonic possession, ritual sacrifice, and occult corruption. The supernatural elements serve as a framework for increasingly extreme scenarios that push far beyond conventional horror into territory that feels genuinely transgressive. Bible Black's narrative structure creates a sense of inevitable doom that permeates every interaction. Players witness the gradual corruption of everyone around the protagonist as dark magic spreads through the school like a contagion. The game's branching paths offer multiple ways to experience this descent into darkness, but every route leads toward the same fundamental conclusion that innocence cannot survive contact with such forces. The visual presentation of Bible Black demonstrates sophisticated understanding of horror aesthetics. The game employs subtle visual cues and atmospheric sound design to create mounting dread that makes scenes feel more like violations than entertainment. This technical competence in service of disturbing content creates an uncomfortable viewing experience that lingers long after the game ends. Starless, developed by Empress in 2015, represents the evolution of disturbing visual novels into something approaching pure psychological assault. The game follows protagonist Yukito as he begins working at a mysterious mansion owned by the wealthy Mamiya family. What initially appears to be a standard employment opportunity quickly reveals itself as something far more sinister. The mansion setting allows developers to create a claustrophobic environment where normal social rules don't apply. Each member of the Mamiya family represents a different form of psychological manipulation, creating a cast of characters designed specifically to break down the protagonist's resistance through various forms of emotional and psychological abuse. Starless pushes boundaries not through supernatural elements or fantasy scenarios, but through unflinching depictions of human cruelty presented as character development. The game forces players to witness the systematic destruction of human dignity through scenarios that feel uncomfortably grounded in psychological reality. What makes Starless particularly disturbing is its clinical approach to depicting psychological breakdown. The developers clearly researched methods of psychological manipulation and incorporated these techniques into their narrative structure. This attention to psychological authenticity transforms what could have been simple shock content into something that feels genuinely threatening to player mental health. Euphoria, developed by ClockUp in 2011, represents the logical extreme of psychological horror visual novels. The game begins with protagonist Keisuke Takatu waking up in a stark white room with no memory of how he arrived there. 6 female characters accompany him in this mysterious prison, and a disembodied voice announces that they must participate in games to secure their freedom. The premise immediately establishes Euphoria as something beyond typical visual novel fare. The clinical white environment and mysterious circumstances create an atmosphere of dread that intensifies as players discover the true nature of their situation. Each revelation about their predicament removes another layer of hope until players realize they're witnessing something approaching pure nightmare fuel. Euphoria's game mechanics force player participation in scenarios that most people would find morally reprehensible. The branching narrative offer different approaches to surviving their imprisonment, but every choice involves some form of moral compromise. This mechanical design transforms players from passive observers into active participants in the character's suffering. The psychological impact of Euphoria extends beyond its immediate shock value. Players report feeling genuinely disturbed for days after completing the game, suggesting that the developers succeeded in creating something that transcends entertainment and approaches genuine psychological assault. This level of impact raises serious questions about the responsibilities of game developers and the limits of creative expression. Cross Days, the spiritual successor to School Days, takes the psychological horror elements of its predecessor and amplifies them through improved technology and more sophisticated narrative techniques. Released in 2010, Cross Days follows a new protagonist while maintaining connections to the original game's cast of characters. The improved visual presentation allows for more detailed depictions of psychological breakdown, making the character's descent into madness feel more immediate and visceral. The enhanced animation systems enable subtle facial expressions and body language that communicate psychological states more effectively than traditional visual novel presentations. Cross Days demonstrates how technical advancement can serve disturbing content by making it more psychologically effective. The improved character models and animation create stronger emotional connections between players and characters, making subsequent betrayals and violence feel more impactful. This technical evolution in service of disturbing content represents a troubling trend in visual novel development. Level 2 concludes with games that achieved notoriety not just for their content, but for their cultural impact. These titles influenced entire subgenres of visual novels and established templates that countless imitators would follow. Their legacy extends far beyond their immediate audience, shaping expectations and normalizing content that previous generations would have found unthinkable. The games in Level 2 share a common characteristic of technical competence in service of moral bankruptcy. Unlike the crude shock value of amateur productions, these titles demonstrate genuine artistic skill directed toward fundamentally disturbing ends. This combination creates products that can't be easily dismissed as simple exploitation because they represent genuine creative effort directed toward transgressive goals. As we prepare to descend into Level 3, the nature of our exploration changes. The games we've encountered so far maintain some connection to commercial viability and mainstream distribution channels. What awaits us in the deeper layers represents content that even Japan's permissive gaming culture struggled to accept, titles that exist in the shadows between legitimate entertainment and something far more disturbing. Level 3 represents a fundamental shift in our exploration. Here we encounter games that cross lines even within Japan's relatively permissive gaming culture, titles that found themselves banned, restricted, or forced into underground distribution channels. These aren't just controversial games, but products that challenged the very foundations of what society considers acceptable entertainment. Maggot Bait stands as perhaps the most psychologically disturbing visual novel ever commercially released. Developed by ClockUp in 2017, this game presents itself as a dark fantasy adventure, but quickly reveals its true nature through scenarios that seem designed specifically to traumatize players. The story follows multiple protagonists trapped in a nightmarish city where human suffering has become the primary form of currency. What separates Maggot Baits from typical horror games is its systematic approach to psychological destruction. Every character arc follows a carefully constructed path from hope to despair, with each narrative beat calculated to maximize emotional impact. The developers demonstrate an almost clinical understanding of psychological trauma, incorporating elements that feel less like entertainment and more like deliberate attempts to inflict lasting mental damage on players. The visual presentation of Maggot Baits employs sophisticated artistic techniques to enhance its disturbing impact. Character designs deliberately evoke innocence before subjecting these figures to scenarios that feel genuinely evil in their conception. The contrast between beautiful artwork and horrific content creates a cognitive dissonance that amplifies the psychological impact far beyond what creepy imagery alone could achieve. Player testimonials about Maggot Baits consistently mention lasting psychological effects, with many reporting difficulty sleeping and persistent intrusive thoughts weeks after completion. This suggests the developers succeeded in creating something that transcends entertainment and enters territory more accurately described as psychological warfare. The fact that such content was commercially distributed raises profound questions about artistic freedom versus social responsibility. Fraternity, developed by Euphemia in 2008, explores themes of revolutionary violence through a lens that makes political extremism feel disturbingly appealing. Set during a fictional revolution, the game follows characters who justify increasingly horrific acts through ideological fervor. What makes Fraternity particularly dangerous isn't just its violent content, but how effectively it presents extremist thinking as rational and necessary. The narrative structure of Fraternity gradually normalizes violence through careful psychological manipulation. Initial acts of resistance seem justified within the game's political context, but each subsequent escalation removes another moral boundary until players find themselves participating in scenarios that mirror real-world atrocities. This progression demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary evil. Fraternity's political themes make it more than just another violent game. The developers clearly researched historical revolutionary movements and incorporated actual propaganda techniques into their narrative design. This attention to historical authenticity transforms fictional violence into something that feels uncomfortably connected to real-world political movements and their associated atrocities. The game's influence extends beyond its immediate audience through online communities that discuss its political themes with disturbing enthusiasm. Some players report that Fraternity fundamentally changed their worldview, suggesting that the game succeeded in its apparent goal of political radicalization through entertainment media. This real-world impact elevates Fraternity from controversial entertainment to something approaching actual propaganda. Dustmania Grotesque, released by Tinkerbell in 2009, represents the absolute nadir of visual novel content masquerading as legitimate entertainment. The game's premise defies description through any civilized vocabulary, involving scenarios that seem designed purely to test the limits of human moral endurance, rather than provide any recognizable form of entertainment value. What makes Dustmania Grotesque particularly disturbing is its complete absence of redeeming qualities. Unlike other games on this iceberg that at least attempt to justify their content through narrative complexity or artistic merit, Dustmania Grotesque exists purely as in transgression. Every element serves no purpose beyond pushing boundaries that probably shouldn't exist in the first place. The technical execution of Dustmania Grotesque demonstrates competent game development skills directed toward fundamentally evil ends. The artwork shows genuine talent, the programming exhibits professional competence, and the sound design creates effective atmospheric effects. This combination of skill and moral vacancy creates something uniquely disturbing because it represents deliberate choices rather than accidental boundary violations. Distribution of Dustmania Grotesque required specialized channels even within Japan's permissive gaming market. Most mainstream retailers refused to carry the title, forcing interested parties to seek it through underground networks typically associated with illegal content. This commercial rejection by even Japan's adult gaming industry suggests content that crossed fundamental lines of human decency. Otome function represents a different category of disturbing content, one that corrupts the typically innocent otome game genre through psychological manipulation techniques that feel genuinely predatory. Developed by ClockUp in 2012, the game initially presents itself as a standard romance simulation targeting female players seeking emotional connection through interactive storytelling. However, Otome function quickly reveals its true purpose as what can only be described as a psychological simulator. The male characters employ manipulation techniques that mirror real-world predatory behavior, creating emotional dependency through carefully orchestrated cycles of affection and withdrawal. Players report feeling genuinely emotionally attached to characters who demonstrate textbook abuse relationship patterns. The insidious nature of Otome function lies in its gradual normalization of unhealthy relationship dynamics. Each romantic option exhibits different forms of emotional manipulation, from gaslighting to isolation tactics, all presented within the framework of romantic fantasy. This systematic corruption of romantic expectations through gaming mechanics represents a particularly evil form of psychological manipulation. Female players who completed Otome function report lasting changes in their relationship expectations and self-worth. Some describe developing tolerance for controlling behavior in real-world relationships after becoming conditioned to accept such treatment as romantic within the game's context. This real-world impact transforms Otome function from questionable entertainment into something approaching actual psychological abuse delivered through gaming media. Dead End Aegis pushes the boundaries of what can be called a game versus what constitutes something entirely different. Released by ClockUp in 2015, this title combines mecha combat scenarios with content so extreme that describing it accurately would likely violate platform guidelines for appropriate discussion. The mecha elements serve as a thin veneer over content that seems designed to corrupt every positive association players might have with heroic narratives. Characters who should represent hope and protection instead become vehicles for scenarios that invert traditional heroic values into something genuinely nightmarish. This systematic corruption of heroic archetypes creates psychological impact that extends far beyond simple shock value. Dead End Aegis employs sophisticated narrative techniques to create emotional investment before systematically destroying everything players come to care about. The mecha combat system creates genuine engagement through well-designed gameplay mechanics, making subsequent narrative violations feel more impactful because they occur after establishing real player investment in the characters and world. The game's title proves prophetic as players discover that every narrative path leads toward the same fundamental conclusion of hopelessness and despair. This deterministic structure creates a sense of inevitable doom that permeates every player choice, transforming interactive entertainment into an exercise in psychological punishment that serves no recognizable entertainment purpose. Sakura no Mori Dreamers represents the complete corruption of childhood innocence through gaming media. Developed by Favorite in 2016, this visual novel employs imagery and themes associated with childhood wonder before subjecting these elements to treatment that feels genuinely evil in its conception and execution. The game's aesthetic presentation deliberately evokes nostalgic feelings for childhood experiences before systematically corrupting these positive associations through scenarios that seem designed to damage fundamental human emotional responses to innocence and wonder. This psychological manipulation technique creates lasting impact that extends far beyond the immediate gaming experience. Player reports about Sakura no Mori dreamers consistently mention difficulty maintaining positive associations with elements that previously brought joy, such as cherry blossoms, school festivals, and childhood friendships. The game appears to succeed in its apparent goal of corrupting positive emotional responses through association with disturbing content presented within familiar contexts. The developers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological conditioning techniques, incorporating elements that create lasting negative associations with previously positive stimuli. This level of psychological manipulation through entertainment media represents something approaching actual mental abuse disguised as interactive fiction. As Level 3 concludes, we must acknowledge that we've entered territory where the term game becomes increasingly inadequate to describe what these products actually represent. The titles in this layer demonstrate technical competence and narrative sophistication directed toward goals that seem fundamentally hostile to human psychological well-being. These games share common characteristics that distinguish them from mere controversial entertainment. They employ psychological manipulation techniques that mirror real-world patterns, create lasting negative impacts on player mental health, and serve no recognizable entertainment purpose beyond the infliction of psychological damage. This systematic approach to psychological harm through gaming media represents something qualitatively different from simple boundary-pushing content. The commercial success of these titles within certain market segments reveals disturbing truths about human nature and the potential for entertainment media to serve fundamentally destructive purposes. The fact that skilled developers, artists, and programmers collaborated to create products designed primarily to inflict psychological damage suggests a level of moral bankruptcy that challenges basic assumptions about creative expression and artistic freedom. Level 4 awaits us in the depths below, where even Japan's underground gaming culture struggled to accept what developers were willing to create. Here we'll encounter titles that exist at the very limits of what can be called entertainment, products that push so far beyond acceptable boundaries that they challenge our understanding of why such things exist at all. Level 4 descends into territory where the very concept of entertainment becomes meaningless. These games exist in a realm beyond conventional understanding, products that seem designed not to entertain, but to test the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. The titles we encounter here were so extreme that even Japan's underground gaming communities struggled to process their existence. The games in this layer share a common characteristic of complete disconnection from any recognizable form of human enjoyment. They represent pure exercises in transgression, created seemingly for no purpose beyond proving that certain boundaries could. The technical skill evident in their development makes their content even more disturbing because it demonstrates deliberate creative choices rather than accidental boundary violations. Closed game represents the logical conclusion of psychological horror gaming taken to its absolute extreme. Developed by Black Package in 2010, this visual novel presents itself as an interactive mystery before revealing its true nature as what can only be described as a systematic assault on human empathy and compassion. The story follows a group of characters trapped in a facility where they must participate in increasingly horrific scenarios to secure their freedom. What distinguishes closed game from typical horror entertainment is its complete absence of catharsis or resolution. Traditional horror provides tension followed by relief, creating emotional cycles that ultimately serve entertainment purposes. Closed game systematically removes every element of relief, creating an experience of pure psychological punishment that serves no recognizable entertainment function. The game's narrative structure employs sophisticated understanding of trauma psychology to create lasting negative impacts on players. Each story beat is calculated to maximize psychological damage while preventing any form of emotional recovery. Players report feeling fundamentally changed by the experience, often describing persistent depression and anxiety that lasted months after completion. The developers demonstrated clinical knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques, incorporating elements that mirror real-world torture methodologies. This level of sophistication in service of psychological destruction raises profound questions about the motivations behind creating such content and the ethical responsibilities of anyone involved in its distribution. Wonderful Everyday, known in Japan as Subarashiki Hibi, presents perhaps the most philosophically disturbing entry in this layer. Developed by Kero Q in 2010, this visual novel combines profound philosophical concepts with content so extreme that it challenges players' fundamental understanding of reality, morality, and human existence itself. The game's structure mirrors academic philosophy texts, incorporating genuine philosophical arguments and complex metaphysical concepts into its narrative framework. This intellectual sophistication serves as a delivery mechanism for content that systematically deconstructs every positive assumption players might hold about human nature, existence, and the possibility of meaning in life. Wonderful Everyday employs multiple narrative perspectives to create a fractured reality where truth becomes increasingly impossible to determine. Each character's viewpoint reveals different aspects of events, but none provide reliable frameworks for understanding what actually occurs. This logical uncertainty extends beyond the game itself, causing players to question their ability to understand reality in general. The philosophical elements aren't mere window dressing, but integral components of the game's assault on player psychology. The developers use legitimate philosophical arguments to justify scenarios that would otherwise be dismissible as simple shock content. This intellectual framework makes the disturbing elements feel more substantial and lasting because they're presented as logical conclusions of serious philosophical inquiry. Player testimonials about Wonderful Everyday consistently mention fundamental changes in worldview and persistent existential anxiety. Many report developing philosophical pessimism and nihilistic tendencies after completion. The game appears to succeed in its apparent goal of philosophical indoctrination through entertainment media, creating lasting changes in how players understand existence itself. Phantom of Inferno represents the complete corruption of action entertainment through psychological manipulation techniques that feel genuinely predatory. Originally developed by Nitroplus in 2000 and later expanded, this visual novel follows assassins who have been psychologically conditioned to kill without emotional attachment or moral consideration. What makes Phantom of Inferno particularly disturbing is how effectively it normalizes violence through psychological conditioning techniques that mirror real-world brainwashing methodologies. Players witness the systematic destruction of the protagonist's humanity through methods that feel uncomfortably grounded in actual psychological research on trauma conditioning and emotional numbing. The game's action sequences are presented with clinical detachment that makes violence feel routine rather than exciting. This emotional numbing extends to players, who report becoming desensitized to depictions of death and suffering through exposure to the game's systematically dehumanized presentation of violence. Phantom of Inferno's influence extends beyond its immediate audience through its impact on subsequent visual novels and anime adaptations. The psychological conditioning techniques depicted in the game have been incorporated into numerous other works, suggesting a cultural normalization of psychological manipulation through entertainment media. Demon Bane, developed by Nitroplus in 2003, combines Lovecraftian cosmic horror with content that pushes far beyond what even extreme horror typically attempts. The game presents itself as a supernatural thriller before revealing scenarios that seem designed to induce genuine psychological breakdown rather than provide entertainment value. The Lovecraftian elements serve as frameworks for content that systematically destroys every positive human emotion and association. Characters who should represent hope or redemption instead become vehicles for scenarios that corrupt fundamental human responses to beauty, love, and meaning. This systematic destruction of positive emotional responses creates lasting psychological damage that extends far beyond the gaming experience. Demonbane employs sophisticated understanding of cosmic horror principles to create existential dread that feels genuinely threatening to player mental health. The game's depiction of cosmic indifference and human insignificance incorporates elements that mirror genuine philosophical arguments about meaninglessness, making the horror feel more substantial than typical supernatural entertainment. Players report persistent feelings of cosmic anxiety and existential dread after completing Demonbane. The game appears to succeed in inducing genuine psychological terror about the nature of existence itself, rather than providing controlled fear experiences typical of horror entertainment. Saya no Uta stands as perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated entry in Level 4, while simultaneously being among the most psychologically destructive. Developed by Nitroplus in 2003, this visual novel explores themes of perception, reality, and human nature through a narrative that systematically corrupts every positive association players might have with love, beauty, and human connection. The story follows Fuminori Sakisaka, whose brain injury causes him to perceive the world as a nightmarish hellscape of decay and corruption. Only one person appears beautiful to him in this transformed reality, but this perception leads to scenarios that challenge fundamental assumptions about love, morality, and human nature itself. Saya no Uta employs sophisticated philosophical arguments about the nature of perception and reality to justify content that would otherwise be dismissible as simple shock value. The game forces players to confront uncomfortable questions about whether love, based on false perceptions, can be genuine, and whether moral behavior has meaning in a universe where perception determines reality. The psychological impact of Saya no Uta extends far beyond typical horror entertainment because it attacks fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral reasoning. Players report persistent questioning of their own perceptions and moral judgments after completion, suggesting that the game succeeds in inducing genuine philosophical anxiety about the nature of reality and ethics. The game's influence on subsequent visual novels and broader Japanese popular culture demonstrates how sophisticated philosophical arguments can be used to normalize extreme content. Many later works incorporate Saya no Uta's techniques for using intellectual frameworks to justify otherwise unacceptable content. Totono, short for Kimi to Kanojo no Koi, represents the complete corruption of romantic simulation through techniques that feel genuinely predatory toward players themselves. Developed by Nitroplus in 2013, this visual novel initially presents itself as a standard dating simulation before revealing its true purpose as a systematic assault on player psychology and emotional well-being. The game's most disturbing element isn't its content, but its direct psychological manipulation of players through breaking the fourth wall in ways that feel genuinely threatening. Characters address players directly, referencing their real-world gaming habits and personal information in ways that create uncomfortable feelings of being watched and judged. Totono employs sophisticated understanding of parasocial relationships to create emotional dependency that extends beyond the gaming experience. Players report developing genuine emotional attachments to characters who systematically manipulate and abuse them through techniques that mirror real-world psychological abuse patterns. The game's technical implementation includes elements that monitor player behavior and incorporate this information into the narrative in ways that make players feel surveilled and vulnerable. This surveillance extends to real-world computer usage patterns, creating privacy violations that transform entertainment into something approaching actual stalking. Player testimonials about Totono consistently mention lasting changes in their ability to form healthy relationships and persistent feelings of being watched or judged. The game appears to succeed in creating lasting psychological damage through sophisticated manipulation of parasocial relationship dynamics. As Level 4 concludes, we must acknowledge that we've encountered products that transcend controversial entertainment and enter territory more accurately described as psychological warfare. These games employ sophisticated understanding of human psychology to create lasting negative impacts that serve no recognizable entertainment purpose. The technical sophistication evident in these titles makes their content even more disturbing because it demonstrates deliberate application of psychological manipulation techniques by skilled developers who clearly understood the potential consequences of their work. This combination of technical competence and moral bankruptcy represents something qualitatively different from simple boundary-pushing content. The commercial distribution of these titles within specialized markets reveals disturbing truths about the potential for entertainment media to serve fundamentally destructive purposes. The fact that audiences existed for products designed primarily to inflict psychological damage suggests cultural problems that extend far beyond individual developer choices. Level 5 awaits in the deepest accessible layers of this iceberg, where we'll encounter games that exist at the absolute limit of what can be called entertainment. These titles pushed so far beyond acceptable boundaries that they challenged the very foundations of what civilized societies consider acceptable creative expression. Level 5 takes us into the absolute abyss of Japanese game development, where titles exist that challenge not just social norms, but the very concept of entertainment itself. These games were so extreme that they forced Japanese society to confront fundamental questions about creative freedom, artistic expression, and the responsibilities that come with both. What we encounter here represents the darkest manifestation of human creativity unleashed from all moral constraints. The games in this layer share a common thread of complete disconnection from any recognizable human values. They represent pure exercises in transgression, created by developers who seemed determined to prove that any boundary could be crossed if sufficient technical skill was applied. The sophistication of their development makes their content infinitely more disturbing because every element represents a deliberate creative choice. Starless Nymphomaniac, the expanded edition of the already notorious Starless, pushed beyond what even underground gaming communities could process. Released by Empress in 2020, this version incorporated player feedback requesting even more extreme content, resulting in something that defied categorization within any known entertainment medium. The expanded edition demonstrated how audience demand could drive developers toward increasingly destructive content creation. Each new scenario represented a response to community requests for boundary-pushing material, creating a feedback loop where audience appetite and developer willingness combine to produce something genuinely evil in its conception and execution. What makes this expanded edition particularly disturbing is its systematic approach to psychological destruction through extended narrative arcs that span dozens of hours. Unlike shorter shock content that provides brief traumatic experiences, this extended format creates prolonged exposure to disturbing material that seems designed to fundamentally alter player psychology through sustained psychological assault. Player communities surrounding this expanded edition developed their own disturbing characteristics, with participants competing to demonstrate their tolerance for extreme content while encouraging developers toward even greater transgression. This community dynamic transformed individual psychological damage into a collective cultural phenomenon that normalized the systematic destruction of human empathy. Maggot Bait Zero, the prequel to the already notorious original, demonstrated how successful psychological assault could be commercialized into an entire franchise dedicated to inflicting mental trauma. Developed by ClockUp in 2019, this prequel explored the origins of the nightmarish world depicted in the original, while somehow managing to be even more psychologically destructive than its predecessor. The prequel format allowed developers to create extended psychological conditioning experiences where players witnessed the systematic transformation of normal human society into the nightmare depicted in the original game. This gradual corruption process proved more psychologically effective than immediate shock content because it normalized extreme scenarios through incremental boundary erosion. Zero employed sophisticated narrative techniques to create emotional investment in characters before systematically destroying everything players came to care about through scenarios that seemed specifically designed to create large trauma associations with positive human emotions like hope, compassion, and love. The commercial success of this prequel within specialized markets demonstrated disturbing truths about audience appetite for content designed primarily to inflict psychological damage. The fact that sufficient demand existed to justify developing an entire prequel focused on trauma creation reveals cultural pathologies that extend far beyond individual gaming choices. Dustmania Absolute, the sequel to Dustmania Grotesque, represented the logical conclusion of transgression-focused game development taken to its absolute extreme. Released by Tinkerbell in 2015, this sequel abandoned any pretense of entertainment value in favor of pure psychological assault delivered through sophisticated technical presentation. The sequel format demonstrated how successful transgression could evolve into systematic psychological warfare through entertainment media. Each element of the expanded content represented a deliberate escalation designed to overcome any tolerance or desensitization players might have developed from previous exposure to extreme material. Absolute employed clinical understanding of trauma psychology to create scenarios that seemed specifically designed to induce lasting psychological damage rather than provide any form of entertainment experience. The technical sophistication evident in its development made the content more disturbing because it demonstrated deliberate application of psychological manipulation techniques by skilled professionals. And there you have it. 7 layers, 23 games, and a descent into the absolute worst that Japanese game development has ever produced. From the mainstream shock value of Battle Raper to the psychological warfare of the deepest layers, we've explored a digital nightmare that most people should never encounter. What we've uncovered isn't just controversial entertainment, but a systematic corruption of the gaming medium itself. These titles reveal how technical skill and creative talent can be perverted to serve the darkest human impulses, creating products that transcend entertainment and enter territory better described as psychological assault. The most disturbing revelation isn't any individual game, but the progression itself. Each layer demonstrates how boundaries can be systematically eroded, how audiences can be conditioned to accept increasingly extreme content, and how entire development communities can organize around the creation of genuine psychological harm. Understanding this dark history helps us appreciate how far gaming has evolved and why certain boundaries exist in the first place. These aren't just arbitrary restrictions, but hard-won protections against the medium's potential for genuine psychological damage. If you made it through this entire iceberg, you've witnessed the absolute depths of human creative expression freed from moral constraints. The question isn't whether these games should exist, but what their existence reveals about the societies that produced them and the audiences that consumed them. Thanks for joining me on this disturbing journey into gaming's darkest corners. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to just how twisted game development can become, and subscribe for more deep dives into the subjects most creators won't touch.